This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network. A huge thanks goes out to Gioia Diliberto, author of the historical novel Coco at the Ritz. Links to learn more about Gioia Diliberto can be found at gioiadiliberto.com or in the show notes. A great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These ratings and reviews really help me know what you think about the show, and by the magic of Apple Podcast algorithm, it helps other people learn about Beyond the Big Screen. To learn more about the Parthenon Podcast Networks and great shows like Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more can be found at parthenonpodcast.com. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can contact me there or send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. Thank you for joining me again, Beyond the Big Screen. I am really excited to welcome our very special guest today, Gioia Diliberto, author of Coco at the Ritz, a novel. Gioia has written biographies on Jane Addams, Hadley, Hemingway, Diane Von Furstenberg, and Brenda.Frazier. Today, we are going to talk about Coco Chanel, the Paris fashion scene during the Nazi occupation, and historical fiction. And I really love the genre of historical fiction, and part of the reason I started this podcast was my interest in learning the real story behind historical fiction and the decisions authors make when writing historical fiction. So I'm definitely excited to talk about this today. I guess a good place to begin is, who was Coco Chanel?
Well, she was a fashion designer who revolutionized fashion after World War I. She basically got women out of corsets and all their fancy clothes, floor-dragging skirts and fancy hairdos with hairpins, and pared down the look of women's fashion, which is in essence, a style of elegance and chic that still influences fashion and defines how a lot of women want to look.
Now, she was extremely well connected. Who are some of the people she knew when was her circle in this artistic community in Paris at that time?
Yeah, she was very well connected. And what she was doing in fashion was related to what a lot of her friends were doing in the other arts, like Stravinsky in music and Picasso in painting, also what Hemingway was doing in writing, this paring away and overturning the old and creating something new, though she didn't know Hemingway personally. But she did know Stravinsky. She had an affair with him, and she knew Picasso. She worked with Picasso. She designed costumes for a production of Antigone that Jean Cocteau did. Picasso did the sets for that production. And she would have liked to have had an affair with Picasso, but Chanel was exactly the kind of strong, aggressive woman that Picasso avoided like the plague. But they all influenced each other. And she was very much a part of that modernist, that post-World War I modernist circle.
What you don't focus on Coco Chanel's entire life in this, you really zoom in on one episode during the Nazi occupation of Paris. Why did you select that particular part of her life?
Well, I had written another novel about Chanel that was published in 2006, and it was set after World War I, when she was just getting her business going. And in the course of doing research for that book, I discovered that she had been arrested by the French Forces of the Interior, which was this after the war, after World War II. And the FFI were a group of ex-soldiers and resistance fighters and ordinary citizens who'd taken up arms after the liberation of Paris and were going around France picking up women who had slept with Germans and shaving their heads. You might have seen pictures of them shaving the heads of these women. Sometimes they were just girls, young teenage girls, and then often stripping them naked and parading them through streets while crowds of jeering people looked on. And Chanel was picked up by these guys because of her romance with a Nazi spy named Hans Gunther von Dinklage, who was known as Spots. And when I discovered this, that she had been hauled out of the Ritz by two guys who could have cared less who she was and cared less about fashion and taken to some undisclosed location for questioning, I thought it was the most fascinating moment in her fascinating life. And so I decided to write another novel about Chanel set during that period.
Where was Chanel at that in her life at that point in the late 1930s, early 1940s? She had a successful career. She's in her late 50s, early 60s. In her career and personal life, where was she at?
Well, she had closed her fashion house in 1939 on the eve of war. And it's still a mystery why she did that. Like so much in Chanel's life, the record is scant, owing to the lack of official documents and her own obfuscation. No one really knows why she closed her house. There's a lot of speculation about it, but in any case, she was out of the business of producing fashion, but her perfume was still being sold and was still a global sensation to this day. It's the most best-selling perfume in the world. And her boutique, where she sold the perfume and a few accessories, was still open. But she was idle, and she pretty much regretted, I think, closing her house from the moment that she did it. So when the war opens, we see her idle and meeting this handsome blonde Nazi who she might have encountered before the war because he had lived in France for a long time. He didn't wear a uniform and he was 13 years younger than she. And she started an affair with him and they lived together at the Ritz, which had been taken over by the Germans. Chanel had had a grand suite there before the war. But when the Germans occupied it, they took over the hotel and relegated the French to the less desirable side. So they moved Chanel out of her fancy suite into two small maids' rooms, and that's where she stayed.
Who was Hans Spots von Dinklage? If you do a casual Googling of him, not a ton of information comes up, at least in English. So he wasn't one of the top Nazis, but he definitely was influential in his spheres.
Well, it's unclear exactly how influential he was. He worked for the Abwehr, which was the German intelligence operation that had been in place before Hitler. And of course, it was connected to the SS, but it wasn't the SS. And he had come from a family of warriors. So he was part of that warrior class. His father had been a military guy and his grandfather, and he had indeed fought during World War I, side by side with his father. And also he worked for a group of the German military that was responsible apparently for murdering Rosa Luxemburg, though it's unclear whether Spots was directly involved in that. And he, as I mentioned, he lived in Paris for a long time, lived in France for a long time. He didn't wear a uniform, and his activities are pretty murky. It's unclear exactly what his role was.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. What was the nature of Chanel and von Dinklage's relationship?
Well, it was a romance. It was a sexual relationship. The quid pro quo was that he smoothed life in Paris for her and during the occupation, and he might have been involved in helping getting her nephew, her beloved nephew, André Palas, released from a German prisoner of war camp. André was in the French military, and he'd been taken prisoner early on in the war. And Spots may have helped her. That may have been one initial reason why she became involved with him. I think it was mostly opportunism. She was lonely. He was the available man. It didn't hurt that he was German. It was going to make life easier for her. And she always aligned herself with those in power. She was in love with him, and I guess in a way that Chanel was in love with people. He I don't know how he felt about her, but they stayed together for a long time. They were together after the war also.
Yeah, that's what I thought was so interesting, is that in the novel, you can see that there's an element of a romance and maybe a real attraction, but Dinklage was definitely working a source with her, and Chanel was getting something out of it. And you think like, oh, well, maybe it is just a convenience for war. But then the fact that they stayed connected for several years after the war kind of twists that and puts that idea on its head.
Yes. And he was, again, very sophisticated. He spoke fluent French and fluent English. His mother was British, and he fit very comfortably into her social world. And because he didn't wear a uniform, and because he spoke fluent French, and because she'd encountered him before the war and he knew people she knew, it was easy for her to forget that he was a Nazi or fool herself that he wasn't a Nazi. We don't know how much Chanel supported Nazi ideology, if at all. We don't even know how much he supported Nazi ideology, if at all. He was a member of the party, certainly. His boss in the Abwehr, Canaris, was actually part of the plot to assassinate Hitler. And Canaris, Spatz's boss, was executed for that role. So Spatz was also associated with people who were anti-Hitler. And it's just not known. In the novel, I portray Coco as fooling herself and also being a little bit unsure. And I think in the novel, you don't really know until the end exactly what Spatz's role is here.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about novelization, but I also get the feeling, and I don't know if this came through in your research, that Chanel was maybe reliving part of her life, that she was at the point where her house was closed and her business is failing. She's getting older, and this romantic relationship with Spatz kind of rekindled a different part of her life in her.
Mm-hmm. I think she always had a man, and there was always somebody, and she needed that. She needed a man to make her feel young and beautiful. And so that was a huge part of it. I don't know what plans she was making about reopening her house, but I think I mentioned in my author's note that one of the things I discovered after I wrote my first Chanel novel that led me on the course to writing this book was in a museum in Paris devoted to the resistance hero Jean Moulin. There was a wall of clippings from the Nazi-controlled Parisian press. So it was all the Parisian newspapers, Le Figaro, Ce Soir, Le Parisien, but they were Nazi censored. And there was this story on the front page of Ce Soir about Chanel and an interview with Chanel talking about reopening her fashion house. So she was clearly at least thinking about doing business with the Germans. She never did. And that struck me as quite extraordinary that she was going to go that far. And that was just at the beginning of my research. So she was probably thinking about starting either with the Germans, which she didn't do, or after, depending on what happened with the war. But she clearly wanted to get back into fashion. And then, of course, her perfume business, that's another story. She was trying to wrest control in using the Nazi race laws to do that from her Jewish partners, the Wertheimers.
What happened to the Paris culture and couture and music and art scene after the Nazis had taken over Paris?
Well, they at first they were talking about moving couture to Berlin. They really wanted to steal whatever they could of French culture. And then they decided not to do that. They decided to keep it in Paris because fashion, high fashion, especially couture, is so closely associated with the national cultural identity and the identity of French women. The idea that the French woman is a woman of elegance and chic, and it's embodied by high fashion. So they decided to keep it in Paris. They wisely realized that you couldn't really take Parisian couture out of Paris. And a few designers stayed and worked with the Germans, like Jacques Fath and Lucien Lelong, who was head of the Chambre Syndicale, which regulated couture. But the Germans also instituted these very draconian restrictions on couture. You could only use so much fabric per garment. They even limited the amount of thread you could use. They limited the amount of garments you could show during a particular collection. So it was a very reduced kind of high fashion. And I'm less familiar with what was going on with the world of art and music, but I know that a lot of artists like Picasso stayed and continued to paint and sell paintings, and Jean Cocteau continued to work, and writers continued to work. Sartre continued to publish. So it continued. It didn't get shut down completely.
It's interesting that there was this division within the Chanel's business enterprises of the perfume aspect, and then the fashion, the couture with the garments. What was the nature of the relationship between her and Pierre Wertheimer? And how did that play out? Because that's kind of one of the more ugly aspects of her time.
Definitely. And one of the more interesting, and the Wertheimer family, the grandsons of her original partner in the perfume business, still own Chanel. Pierre Wertheimer and his brother Paul owned the biggest perfume factory business in France in the 1920s. It started before that. It goes back to the 19th century, I think. And when Chanel created Chanel No. 5 with a nose, as the perfumers were called, named Ernest Beau, she entered into an agreement with Pierre Wertheimer to manufacture and distribute it, never thinking that it was going to be this huge success. What she cared about in the early 1920s was the fashion, and her agreement with Pierre Wertheimer let her keep the fashion, and he got 80% of the perfume. She got 10%, and another investor got 10%. And then the perfume was this global sensation, and she suddenly decided she wanted more. She wanted more of the profits. And she'd created this perfume, albeit with this nose, Ernest Beau, but she thought it was hers. She wanted more. And she started suing him. And nothing came of the lawsuits over the years. Now the war comes. The Germans are occupying Paris. They are seizing Jewish businesses. The Wertheimers fled to New York, so they were safe physically. They had taken the formula for Chanel No. 5 with them, and they also managed to smuggle out of France big blocks of jasmine extract, a key ingredient of Chanel No. 5, and they were continuing to manufacture the perfume from Hoboken, and it was making them all rich. And Coco went to the Gestapo and said, my business is owned 80% by Jews who have fled and abandoned it. And now I, as a Christian French woman, should wrest full control. But the Wertheimers outsmarted her. They managed to transfer their shares to a French Christian businessman named Felix Amiot, who was making airplanes for the Germans. And the quid pro quo there was that Amiot would protect their shares and return it to them after the war if the Allies won, and then they would vouch for him. So you see, nobody here is morally pure. You have the Wertheimers, Jews, collaborating with the collaborator. It makes the story very interesting and very complicated.
They were operating then in a parallel to, was Chanel No. 5 still being manufactured in France as well?
I'm not really sure. I don't think it was, but I think it was mostly being manufactured in Hoboken during the war and sold at PXs and drugstores and all over the place in America. Chanel, meanwhile, when she couldn't get it back, she started bad-mouthing it. She stopped wearing it herself, even though this is the product that's making her rich. And she started producing her own perfumes in violation of her contract with the Wertheimers. And it's a little unclear if that started during the war, but it definitely started after the war when she was living in exile in Switzerland.
The Jews of Paris and France, they were really involved in every aspect of fashion and culture and business. Did Chanel know to the degree that the Nazis were persecuted? She would have known the persecution, but did she know about the Holocaust and all of the other events that were unfolding?
It's unknown. Most people did not know about the camps until the end of the war, or they didn't want to know, but they didn't really know and they didn't want to know. And it's unknown what she knew. She was on record saying some ugly anti-Semitic things, and she's generally considered as somebody who was anti-Semitic. And indeed, there is a lot of anti-Semitism in her circle. And we could even talk about the connection between fascism and fashion. But it's unknown. She grew up poor. She was, not that there's a connection between poverty and anti-Semitism, but she had her mother died when she was 12, and her father put her and her sisters into a convent orphanage where she was raised by these nuns in rural France. So she probably heard a lot of anti-Jewish things. And so this anti-Semitism was sort of something that she grew up with. It was this kind of reflexive thing. She did have Jewish friends, and she had Jewish friends she helped. In the book, she helps Max Jacob. They were indeed friends. He was a very close friend of Picasso. He was part of the artistic circle that she was in. So it's difficult to know exactly where she stood, but she was a humanist. She would not have thought, I don't think, that an artist should have been persecuted for being Jewish, or that somebody should have been denied their profession for being Jewish. She had a Jewish doctor. So
yeah, it's hard to tell that was she doing just opportunism and something that she probably thought was right because she had done opportunistic things that maybe hurt other people along the way, but it was furthering her career, not separating it, that, and maybe not knowing that there was going to be dire outcomes for some of the people who she may have just been trying to leapfrog over.
She was an opportunist above all. She was going to align herself with whoever won the war, who was ever in power. She always wanted more for herself. And that, if we wanted to be really Freudian about it, came probably originally from this complete deprivation she had as a child. No money, no possessions, no love. She always wanted more, more, and more, and it was never enough. And when the occupation came, there is this stark division between who has it and who doesn't have it. And she was going to stay with the people who had it as long as they were in power.
It's interesting you bring up the connection of fashion to fascism, and this 20s and 30s time is where many things are changing. Art and architecture are all changing. What do you find is the connection there?
Well, fashion has always historically been about exclusion. And, there are these fashion leaders, arbiters of taste. Even recently, if you think of Karl Lagerfeld, who took over Chanel until his death, he ran it for decades. And remember the terrible episode with the Dior designer, Jean Galliano, about 10 years ago, when he was caught on tape making vile anti-Semitic remarks in a bar in Paris. And he started out, he was fined for making a racial slur because of that. And it was just a really ugly, vile episode. And he started out, you can go online, I don't know if it's still online, and listen to the tape of his recording of him attacking this woman who actually wasn't even Jewish, as it turned out, but he attacks her for being a Jew. And then I won't repeat what he said, it's too horrible. But he starts out by attacking her boots. Her boots are ugly, and then it goes from there. And that's kind of what happens fashion, you start out by excluding somebody because they're not wearing the right dress or the right boots. And it's a slippery slope from there to start excluding them for other reasons, for ethnic reasons and racial reasons. And so there's always been that problem with fashion, with it being this very exclusive realm led by these outsized, often charismatic figures like Karl Lagerfeld and Coco Chanel.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. Another exclusive and institution is the Ritz Hotel, and the Ritz almost becomes a character in the novel and in the whole episode. What was special about the Ritz?
The luxury, I've never stayed there, so I don't know what it's like to stay there, but it was just the height of luxury and comfort. And also it was right across the street from her boutique and her atelier, when she had her atelier running. And so it was very easy for her to go back and forth. And she had an apartment above the atelier on Rue Cambon where she entertained. She had meals there and she had an office there, but she slept at the Ritz. And I think the comfort and luxury substituted for family life for her, because she never married and none of her romances ever lasted. So she never had an enduring relationship with a man, never had children.
Was the Ritz the place where the very top ranked Nazis stayed?
Yes, it was. And there was a giant swastika hanging over the entrance. So another woman who wasn't so opportunistic would have thought, it's probably not a great idea to stay here. And I'm going to go to my country house, because she had her country house. She could have stayed there. And she also had her apartment across the street. She could have moved a bed in there. But no, she decided to move in to the Ritz, to the Nazi-controlled Ritz.
In the novel, you try and get into her head a bit about that. Did you research, or did she ever write anything later about, she didn't have to do very much to at least put a little separation between herself and her Nazis. I mean, she's staying in the Nazis' house, essentially in Paris, when she could have lived across the street and had that much of an insulation between her and the Nazis.
Yes. You mean, what do I know? Or what?
Yeah. And what did she ever write anything about later about that to maybe explain herself?
No. And getting to the point of writing historical fiction, I had great latitude because she didn't write anything. And she said very little about it. And she was famously a liar. And my first rule about writing historical fiction is to never contradict the known truth. But there were so few known truths about this. Of course, I read everything I could about her, all the biographies, but so much wasn't known. The record was so scant, and it just gave me this great opportunity for invention. And also, the only way to really get at her motivations was imaginatively, because she didn't write anything about it or talk about it.
What was maybe your research, talking now a bit more about the novel process as a writer? What was your research and writing process for this novel?
Well, I just read everything. As I said, I read not only everything I could about Chanel, but also about the period. So I just immersed myself totally, which is what I always do. I live in it, live in the period, live with the characters. And I read biographies of all the ancillary characters like Jean Cocteau and Max Jacob, on and on and on. So there was that, and tried to read so much that I just owned it. And then I had her voice, and I don't know why I had her voice, but for a long time, thank God I don't have it anymore. I can't access it, but I don't have to hear her in my head. But I could write Chanel dialogue until the cows came home for a long time. But that's just a little piece of it. I mean, that made it easier to an extent, but it was still really, really hard. And I first wrote it as a play because I didn't have to be in her head. Because I didn't really want to be in her head because of her not being a very moral character, for being rather dislikable. I didn't want to be in her head. So writing the play, I was able to have some distance. But then I decided to explore it more. I wasn't satisfied. I'm a prose writer, I found the play a very difficult form, literary form, and I wanted to try it as a novel. And so in the novel, I did have to go deeper into her head and try and explore her motivations. But I did it in the close third person, not the first person. So I could still have some distance from her.
How did you get to know some of these people like Dinklage who don't have as much information about them? Did you have to create more of a character for him?
Yes, I pretty much created him. I took what was known as the scaffold, and you know more about him at the end during the interrogation when it comes out what he did, more of his activities. But beyond the few facts that had been printed about him, I was able to invent a personality.
One other historical event that happened during this time period was Chanel's attempt, you might call it, to broker a peace deal between Nazi Germany and England or Great Britain. What was that all about? And did it ever seem like it never seemed like it was something that was ever going to really happen? It was just sort of a fool's errand.
It was absolutely crazy, insane. But we know it happened because of documents that were declassified in the 80s, and also because Walter Schellenberg, who was the head of foreign intelligence for the Germans, who authorized this mission, which was known as Model Hut, which means fashion hat in German. He testified during Nuremberg about it a little bit. Chanel and Spots, I think it's just also very, very murky exactly what happened. But this incident is used as the damning evidence that she was on the side of the Germans and was a collaborator. And I don't see it that way. I think it's much more nuanced and complicated than that. She and Spots cooked up this idea that they were going to broker a separate peace because Chanel was friends with Churchill, which she was. She knew him when she was dating the richest man in England, the Duke of Westminster. And he and Churchill were friendly, and Chanel spent a lot of time with Churchill at country house parties, and Churchill really liked her and admired her and thought she was really smart. And so Chanel had this idea that she was going to be known as the woman who ended the war. And she knew that at this time, the Germans were flagging, things weren't looking so good for them. And there were also Nazis in the high command who were turning against Hitler, like Spots' boss. So she thought, we'll go to Madrid, where Churchill is stopping on his way home from the Tehran conference, and we'll talk to him. I'll talk to him because I know how to talk to the English, and I'll get him to negotiate with Hitler, because Churchill had said, I'm never negotiating with Hitler. But she was presumably wanting to broker a peace that was going to be satisfactory to everybody, including France. She wasn't doing this on behalf of Hitler, which I think a lot of people don't understand. It was insane. And what happened was she went to Madrid, Schellenberg authorized it, and Churchill ended up not stopping in Madrid because he got sick. So he went immediately back to London, and the whole thing fell apart.
Do you think even if Churchill had gotten to Madrid, that this would have gone anywhere?
No. And then she tried to cover herself by writing a letter. And that letter, I reproduced that letter. That's a genuine letter in the novel. And she tried to cover herself and make an excuse so that if it ever came out, she would be cleared. And we don't even know if he got that letter. The letter exists. It's in the Churchill archives in London. And we know that 2 secretaries of Churchill saw it, but we don't know if Churchill ever saw it. It did get to 10 Downing Street, but whether or not he ever saw it, whether he ever responded to it, nobody knows.
You write about the end of World War II and the end of the occupation. And I won't go into that part too much because people should really read the novel and read that section because it's very interesting. But what's maybe the rest of Chanel's story? How does she survive as being viewed as a collaborator to the Nazis?
Well, she lived in exile for 10 years. And she went back to France. She did go back occasionally to visit, and she also went back to testify at the trial of the collaborator Vaufrelon, who's a character in the book. He's part of a so-called spy mission she went on. And she entered into an agreement with the Wertheimers in the early 50s that ended all the lawsuits. And that was because they were worried about her bad-mouthing Chanel No. 5 and also producing these other rival perfumes. And they were especially concerned that attention was going to be drawn to her as somebody who lived at the Ritz with a Nazi during the war, and that her wartime activities were going to make the brand suffer. And the brand was exploding and making them all rich. So they had to put a stop to her, to the chance of negative publicity, and to also Coco's bad-mouthing them. So they basically gave her everything she wanted, which was, millions of dollars a year. And also they agreed to bankroll her return to fashion. And so she went back to Paris and reopened her fashion house in 1954. And the wool boucle suit that you think of as the iconic Chanel piece of clothing was produced in that 1954 collection. The French panned it because the French knew how she had behaved. They remembered it. They weren't going to forgive her. But Americans were largely ignorant of her personal life. So Americans raved about her return to fashion. They treated it like the second coming of the fashion messiah. So it was us in America who made her the success that she was the second time around.
Did she ever consider moving to America to get away from maybe the negative publicity in France?
No, she didn't like America. She had designed for Hollywood briefly once, and she didn't like that at all. And she was the quintessential Parisian. She could not have lived anywhere else.
And it was never really too hot for her. And after she came back, was she just kind of a pariah, or did she work her way back into the scene?
And no, she was close to Jean Cocteau, who had also been all mixed up with the Germans, though he was the one who started the petition to save Max Jacob. And she lived out her life with her circle of friends who were also most of men. Serge Lefar, who was head of the Paris Opera Ballet, who was also a collaborator. So a lot of her friends in her closest circle have been collaborators with her.
Yeah, it's really interesting that she was able to survive that and really thrive afterwards. She gets a whole another version of her career after World War II.
Right. But she's buried in Switzerland, and her trust, it was in Switzerland also. So, and I've always wondered why she was buried in Switzerland. I never could quite figure that out. And I wondered if it had something to do with how she had behaved during the war.
Do you know, did she have an heir that she passed on her interests in Chanel to?
No, the Wertheimers own the company. She probably left something to her nieces, who were the children, and her nephew, who were still alive when she died. There were always rumors that her nephew was really her son, but I don't think that's true. And one of the major pieces of evidence against it is that they never claimed her fortune, which I think they would have done had they been direct descendants of hers. But it's unclear exactly what happened to all of her money, except for the Wertheimers did own the business and still own it.
After living with Chanel for so long and getting into her head, what's your assessment of her?
I still think she's fascinating. I think she's tragic. I think that her accomplishments are extraordinary. I think she was a visionary, a real creative genius in her way. Obviously, fashion is an ephemeral art among the arts, but she was a real creator. But her legacy has been severely tarnished by how she behaved during the war. So I think both have to be acknowledged. I do not think Chanel should be canceled. I think if you want to wear Chanel and you can afford it, that's fine with me. I know there are people who do think she should be canceled. I don't feel that way at all. But I think her full life has to be acknowledged. And the company, you can't blame them. They pretty much have whitewashed her. They use the founder, Coco Chanel, in their promotion, but the aspects of what she did during the war are completely ignored.
And one last question I have that it really fascinates me is, as a writer, that you have absorbed and lived with this person for so long. You've written 2 novels about her. Is it easy are you ready to move on from her, or is it hard to leave a subject who you've really gotten to know so much?
Well, I finished the book more than a year ago. I actually finished it. I ghost wrote a book. I finished it pretty much, and then I got a job ghostwriting a nonfiction book, a political memoir. And so I've been away from it for about 2 years, and I've started another book, a nonfiction book, actually. So I'm now pretty distanced from her, and I'm glad, because I was definitely ready to move.
Are there some other historical fiction projects that you would like to tackle?
Well, I would love to have a good one if you have a good idea.
Well, I mean, I think some of these other people in that setting of the French occupation, or the Nazi occupation of France, there just seems like there's so much in that world, right, to explore.
I would want to write about somebody that's sympathetic, however, because it's very, very hard to write about somebody that your reader is not rooting for. This works because it's Chanel, and you're fascinated by her, and you're wondering how she's going to get out of this and what her choices are going to be. But it's much more satisfying to write about somebody who you can really fall in love with and be rooting for at every step of the way. I'm not every step of the way. I mean, it's better to have a complicated character, of course, but somebody who is not sleeping with a Nazi.
I think that's what's so fascinating to me about occupations, especially the French occupation, because the occupation of France by the Nazis is that nobody had their hands entirely clean during the resistance were fighting against the Nazis, but even during that time, they would oftentimes do explosions that would kill innocent people. And nobody was completely pure during that.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that interested me and why I was drawn to writing about it, exploring the chance to explore the moral ambiguities of war, which I find really interesting. And it's exemplified in this story and personified in Coco, who in a way stands for France's treachery. And as André Gide said, most people were neither heroes of resistance or villains of collaboration. Most people were like old shoes, battered and torn, trying to stay afloat in murky waters.